In this session, I'm going to discuss the loss of self in trauma as it relates to the insula, that area of the brain that allows us to feel into internal experiences. So in a previous session, I discussed the insula briefly. The way I described it is that it's the area that allows you to notice what physical sensations you're experiencing. This is a critical brain area if we're going to experience ourselves. So the self probably resides in many, many areas of the brain, but I think of the insula as a key piece because it allows us to feel our bodies. So maybe as you're watching this session, if it's morning time and you've drank your coffee, you might be sitting there thinking, why am I feeling so upset right now? Or why am I feeling so anxious? And then you might realize it's because you've drank one too many cups of coffee. If you've ever had that experience, what you're doing is you're trying to interpret an emotion based on the physical sensations that you're having. So the insula, in the context of trauma, what's going on? Two things can happen with the insula. One is that the insula can be very underactive in trauma. And the second thing is that it can be very overactive in trauma. So I think of this area of the brain as being dysregulated in trauma. What we want with a well-working insula is we want it to be strong and online, but also not hyper-reactive. So we want to be able to feel into the internal experiences that are occurring in the body in an accurate way. Let me tell you a little bit about how the insula functions. So most people have never even heard of this area of the brain, which always surprises me because I think of it as the mind-body connector, really, in the brain. So let me describe to you how it works. When sensory information comes into the body, it travels up your spinal cord and it becomes processed by some low brain areas. And then that signal travels up to the insula. And the insula is a limbic structure in the brain. Remember, it's part of that emotional brain. When the information from your body reaches the insula, it actually reaches the back end of the insula, called the posterior insula. At the moment that happens, that is when you become aware of a physical sensation. So you might, for instance, notice, my heart is starting to race. That means it's entered the back part of the insula. Then that signal travels through the insula into a midsection. And when it gets to the middle of the insula, that's where we assign a feeling to the physical sensation. So we call this core affect. And all this means is that we interpret it as pleasant or aversive. Okay, so this heart rate is something that is a positive thing, or maybe it's a negative thing. As it moves through the insula to the front part of the insula that we call anterior insula, this is when it gets interpreted. And it does this with the help, actually, of the cingulate and some areas of the prefrontal cortex as well. So this is when you put an interpretation on what you're feeling in your body. So that might be the moment that you say, I drank too much coffee. Or I might say to myself, my heart is racing. It must mean that I'm scared of dying in a plane crash. Or I might interpret it as I'm falling in love. And these are going to produce different sensations, different emotions, but the sensation is actually the same in both cases. So we can think of the insula as combining the physical sensations along with the cognitive interpretation. And this is really how an emotion is made. So emotions are comprised of physical sensations, the feelings or that core affect, and then thoughts. So it's actually something that a lot of people misunderstand. They think that emotions are separate from thoughts, but actually thoughts are a core piece of emotions. But physical sensations are a key piece as well. And with a lowly activated insula, it becomes difficult to feel into the body. And if you don't know what's happening in the body, it's hard to know what you're experiencing emotionally. And it can actually make treatment very difficult because a key goal in therapy is usually to learn how to regulate emotion and to become more aware of the self. So with an underactive insula after trauma, we're going to see things like numbing symptoms, emotional numbing symptoms, but also maybe people not picking up on physical cues in their body. In the most extreme form of insula underactivation, we might also see dissociation. And what dissociation means is that you exit the present moment, that you actually leave your body and you leave the present moment. You might feel a little bit spacey. You might feel as though you've disappeared for a little bit, or you might have a flashback where you feel as though you are reliving a traumatic event. And that would be extreme insula underactivation. So let me give an example of this in my own practice. I previously treated a woman who had suffered from extensive trauma in childhood, trauma and neglect. And the reason that she came to therapy, she said, was that she could not access loving feelings for her children. She said, I know I love my kids. I know I love them more than anything in the world, but I'm ashamed to admit it. I can't really feel the love. Another thing that she mentioned sort of offhand in kind of a joking manner was that she didn't really experience hunger either, but she didn't see this to be a problem. She said, yes, I don't really get hungry, but that's okay because it keeps me thin. What she wasn't realizing at the time, took a while for her to understand this, is that that's all the insula. That's all insula underactivation. That emotional numbing that she was experiencing with her children, and that lack of physical awareness of hunger signals. These things go together in the insula. And as she progressed through therapy, she was able to feel more into her internal experiences. She was able to feel more into her body. And she also started to access loving feelings toward her children, as well as some other emotions that she didn't count on, such as feeling anger. But at least with the awareness of these things, we were able to begin to work on them. The other thing that can happen in trauma, and sometimes within the same person, is hyperactivation of the insula. So again, we think of the insula as being dysregulated after trauma. Hyperactive insulas result in feeling as though the trauma is happening again when something reminds you of it. So maybe you almost drown in a canoeing accident. And every time you drive by a lake and you look at that lake, it reminds you of that traumatic memory. What can happen if that memory was not encoded with that timestamp that tells you it was in the past is that you might feel as though you're reliving pieces of it all over again, even as you're driving in the car. What can happen in those moments is that the insula will overactivate and start to give you signals that are inaccurate, but that tell you that that trauma is happening to the body all over again. So you re-experience the physical sensations and the emotions of that trauma. So in trauma treatment, we want a well-working, strong insula, but that is also well-regulated. If you're interested in strengthening your insula and regulating it and getting back into your own body, here's a few tips that I can suggest, things that you can start doing today, which can help this area of the brain. So one of the things that you can do is start to pay close attention to any sensory experiences that you have. So by simply noticing what we're looking at or noticing what we're touching, it results in a small activation of the insula. And if we do this enough over time, what happens is the baseline activation of this structure of the brain will slowly increase. And you will have a stronger felt sense, as Peter Levine calls it, which just basically means that you have this feeling that you occupy your body and own your body and are aware of what's happening in the body. So an example of this might be a mindful raisin eating exercise. So you put the raisin in your mouth and you just notice the texture and the taste. And you don't do this while you're on your computer or your phone or watching TV, but you might just close your eyes and notice what this experience feels like. For me, I prefer to do this with chocolate. You can do this with whatever you would like. But you want to feel into that experience, just noticing the taste. You can also do this by holding an object in your hand and just noticing what the texture feels like, what the temperature feels like. You might notice that it's soft or hard or rough or smooth, and you just spend a moment connecting with that object. And then maybe you connect with a second object and you notice how it feels different from the first. I know this sounds ridiculously simple, and it is, but sometimes the simplest of techniques can result in the most dramatic brain change if it's something that we can practice on a regular basis and really pay attention to. So the next time you're doing dishes, I want you to really feel the dish. I want you to feel the hot water. The next time you're in the shower, I want you to notice the texture of the water feeling as it's streaming down your back. Notice what your food tastes like. Put the phone away, maybe turn off the TV, and really focus on being in the present moment. If your goal is to help regulate the insula, maybe you think that the insula is a little bit hyper-reactive. A great thing you can do is connect with your pulse. So the exercises I've just described, where you're connecting with things in the external environment, a lot of times we'll call these grounding exercises or sensory awareness exercises because you're engaging one or more of your senses. So we're connecting with things outside of us. But another type of insula building exercise is when we connect with the body directly. So connecting with the pulse here or down here. What we can do is a sort of mini meditation with the pulse where you find the pulse. I prefer on the wrist, but you can do it however you'd like. And what you do is you locate the pulse and you begin to notice the sensation of the thumps on your fingers. So right now I can feel my own pulse on my left fingers. And then you just stay there and feel into it. When I do this with clients, sometimes I'll actually have them close their eyes as they do this and bring into their mind's eye a visual representation of their heart, and to imagine that every time they feel the thumping on the wrist, it corresponds to a beating of the heart. So what we're doing from the outside is we're feeling into the heart from the outside in. Sometimes we have these mindfulness practices where we instruct people to connect with the breath, feel into the heart. And those are sort of vague instructions that don't mean much to people. But in this way, we really can connect and feel into the heart. And one variant of this that you can do, and I encourage you to try this, next time you feel a little bit stressed, maybe you have a stressful work meeting coming up or a deadline that's approaching that you're a little bit worried about meeting. Take your pulse. You can actually time it. So the way you do this is you locate the pulse, time it for 6 seconds and multiply it by 10, and that's your pulse. Take the pulse and see how high it is. And if you're stressed, you'll notice that it is a little bit high. And then what I want you to do is engage in this heart connection meditation where you close your eyes and imagine that the heart is beating in sync with the pulsing on your wrist. And maintain that connection to the pulse for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And at the end of that time, take your pulse again. Again, time it for 6 seconds, multiply it by 10, and see what has happened to the pulse. And I can almost guarantee you that if during that practice you have just focused on the body, focused inward on this thumping, your pulse will come down. Because when it comes to physical awareness or awareness of physical sensations, what we monitor, we automatically start to modify. So self-regulation comes with self-awareness. And this can be a powerful realization for clients who are suffering from trauma symptoms or maybe an anxiety disorder. Or a lot of times what those disorders tell us is to focus outward, and that we want to get away from the body. It's almost like we want to unzip our skin and run out away from our body as far as we can get. And what we don't realize is that there's actually a lot of healing that can happen when we just shift that attention inward and begin to rebuild and regulate the insula.